This podcast is brought to you by Ranch Vision, the software ranchers use to boost profits and make better decisions.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rich Brazil. I am the founder of Ranch Vision. This program was designed for producers like you. It's a unique, one-of-a-kind, forward-looking software program that enables you to see the results of your management decisions months and years into the future, from your herd numbers to your replacement costs, break-even values, enterprise efficiency, your profit and loss, your cash flow, and so much more. With this program, you can move forward with confidence into the future. Ranch Vision isn't a historical record-keeping program like all the other programs you might have seen. It looks forward. It is a very challenging, very competitive industry, and every ranch business is unique, has different variables, different opportunities, different constraints. Ranch Vision was designed to take uncertainty out of your future, to enable you to plan to profit. Please go to our website to learn more, www.ranchvision.io. Grazing livestock and just grazing animals in general are a significant part of the planet. That really is the planet.
The average age of the farmer in America is 58 years old. That is not sustainable.
We've been hit with water curtailments. We've been hit with low prices by the conditions, by the rain, by the lamb crop, by the calf crop.
I heard a Native American gentleman say, wilderness, that's an invention of the white man, because we took care of this land.
Sometimes fighting doesn't mean shouting and screaming and pounding your fist. Sometimes it's just putting your boots on and being there for work the next day.
Indians are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves. I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people.
There are cowboys still around. You just probably don't see them because we're working all the time.
I'm Keely Brazil Cavallo, and this is America on One.
Today I'm speaking with Nicolette Hahn Niman, who is an absolutely fascinating person. And as I tell her in the intro of this episode, I would have interviewed Nicolette for any number of reasons. Today I'm talking to her because she's running for Congress against Jared Huffman, who is the representative for both Point Reyes in Northern California and also many of the constituents impacted by the removal of the Potter Valley dams. So she is at the center of two of the biggest stories that I've covered in the last year or so. Not only is Nicolette running to represent the people who would lose their water if the Potter Valley dams were removed, she is also herself a Point Reyes rancher. She's one of the two ranching families that will be staying in Point Reyes National Seashore after the forced ouster of 11 ranching families in an announcement made last January by the Biden administration in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy, a $1 billion environmental NGO that bought out the historic leases of the Point Reyes families in a secretive deal involving litigation with other environmental nonprofits stretching back years. So we talk about that a little bit. We talk about the Potter Valley Project. We talk about Nicolette's background as an environmental attorney who worked with RFK Jr. at Waterkeeper, her work as a renowned speaker and author and writer. Nicolette was a former vegetarian who married a cattle rancher in Point Reyes and is now one of the most eloquent and powerful voices for beef production in the United States. She's an impressive person. I was so excited to speak with her. I've been reading her book for the past week. I'm about halfway through, and it is one of the best books I've read in a while, as I tell her. It's called Defending Beef. She also wrote The Righteous Pork Chop. Before that, both about meat production and agriculture and what we've gotten wrong in the last 60 years or so of public policy when it comes to animal agriculture, grazing, and its interaction with our rangelands. So there are so many things I could have asked Nicolette, but this is primary week. June 2nd is the primary in Northern California. She and 6 other folks are challenging incumbent Jared Huffman for the District 2 congressional seat. She's running as an independent in a very, very diverse district that was redrawn by Prop 50. For those of you who aren't from California, Prop 50 was Gavin Newsom's effort to redistrict California to give Democrats more seats in Congress as a response to redistricting in Texas. that left those of us in Northern California as sort of casualties of this larger macro political war going on, where folks who deal with the most rural and remote part of our state, who are ranchers and fishermen and loggers and blue collar workers, will now find themselves represented, as of right now, by Jared Huffman, who is an environmental attorney who lives in Marin County. Could not be a more different lifestyle. So Nicolette is challenging him, and she talks about what she's learned on the campaign trail and her efforts to spark conversation and to represent this diverse district, which she describes as a microcosm of the larger rural urban divide in America, sort of ground zero for that bigger division that we have in our country there in District 2 of California. She wants to represent everybody in the district, to host those conversations, and to hopefully lead toward a more pragmatic and thoughtful politics that thinks about the future for all of us, and is separated from unrealistic ideology and is more focused on the basic business of running a country and leaving a landscape and an agricultural system and a culture that our kids can inherit and be proud of. So I loved my conversation with Nicolette, and I'm looking forward to the next one. There were so many times that I wanted to ask her more questions, but we only had about 40 minutes, and I really appreciated her making time for me in the middle of her super, super busy campaign week. I'd really recommend that you guys check out her book, Defending Beef. It's truly a tour de force, defending agriculture from someone with just one of the more unique backgrounds that I have encountered. I hope you guys enjoy this conversation. Drop any questions you have in the comments. Let me know what you thought and who you want me to have on next. It's definitely political season, and I'm having a few more political candidates on the show than I am used to having. I have some more scheduled, but hopefully we're having conversations about issues that impact your life. They aren't just culture war issues. They aren't just hot topics that we've heard plenty of already. Hopefully these are some conversations that maybe enter new territory, spark new conversations, and help us find new areas of common ground and optimism and opportunity as a country. That's really what I'm all about here at On One. So here's Nicolette. Guys, welcome back to On One. I'm here with Nicolette Niman. She is a writer. She's running for Congress. She's a rancher. There are so many reasons I could be talking to Nicolette today, and we're just going to try to cover all of them in the time we have. Thank you so much for joining me, Nicolette.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you grew up in Michigan. You studied biology and French. You got a law degree, and then you worked as a senior environmental attorney for Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Waterkeeper Alliance. You sued factory farms. Then you married a cattle rancher. Now you're running for Congress. Did I miss anything? Is that a good overview?
Well, that's a good overview. Yes.
You've got quite a bio.
And then had 2 kids and wrote 3 books in the last few years. And like you said, now running for Congress.
That's right. Well, I just told you before we started recording, I'm reading your book, Defending Beef, right now. And it's genuinely one of the best books I've read in a while. It's incredible. It is very comprehensive. And I think your background is so compelling. You argue from the environmental tradition, not against it. And I think that makes you a force to be reckoned with in the space. You've spoken at Nobel Week Dialogue in 2016 in Stockholm. You've been in a bunch of films and documentaries. You've written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, The Chronicle, The Atlantic. You have a very impressive background. You've been educating people about the importance of beef for quite a while.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, it's interesting because when I first came into this, working on agriculture and food related issues, it was as an environmental lawyer. And as you mentioned, I was working for Waterkeeper. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was the head of it at that time. And I was working with him on this. I should just quickly footnote this by saying that when I tell people in agriculture that I have this environmental law background, they get a little nervous. So I like to sort of explain, well, first of all, I've learned a lot in the last 23 years living on a ranch, but also really the work I was doing was not the kind of classic environmental work against agriculture that a lot of people tend to think of, and especially here out west as the way it manifests itself, where it's really very, there's a lot of work sort of by environmental nonprofits that's really about shutting down agriculture or, shutting off the water or like here in Point Reyes, removing ranching from, publicly owned lands or things like that. The work we were doing when I was at Waterkeeper it was actually primarily people in agriculture. They were rural residents, many of whom were multi-generational farmers. And what was happening was their land was being altered and their water was being altered by the presence of large-scale industrial style, corporately owned agricultural operations that were coming into their communities and setting up shop near where they lived and worked. And so it was actually rural people and people in agriculture that we were defending. And it's kind of an interesting footnote now because, I haven't worked for Bobby Kennedy Jr. in a long time. It's been over 20 years. But it was really his passion for speaking up for people that didn't have a voice that actually kind of led us down the pathway of doing that work. Because what we discovered was that in state legislatures and in Washington, D.C., the rural voice had very little weight. And so you would have, for example, in Missouri, one of the places we were working, we found that you had these multi-generational farms in these, beautiful hilly landscapes. A lot of them were raising cattle on these lands. And then Premium Standard Farms, one of the largest pork producing companies in the world, was going to the state legislature and was actually lobbying to have the local laws not apply to them. And so they could go into a place like Unionville, Missouri, where I spent quite a bit of time, and they could just set up shop even though they were violating all of the local zoning and ordinances that had been passed that would prevent them from doing what they were doing. But they had gotten an exemption at the state capitol. So it was kind of a perfect example of a lot of the stuff that Keely, that you talk about in, a lot of your work. This idea that the rural people and the rural voices didn't matter. They were just being kind of run roughshod over. And in that case, it was kind of an agricultural interest, yes, but it was really a big corporation with a lot of political clout. And that was what was driving our work. And so, and I just kind of mention this because, there's a lot of interest in Bobby Kennedy Jr. because he's in the Trump administration and, at HHS now. But that was how I got into all this, was because of this idea that it was kind of a voice for people that didn't have a voice, and trying to provide. A lot of my work actually was providing advice and grassroots organizing assistance to people in rural communities that were trying to fight against these big corporate operations that were coming in. So that's a long time ago, but just to sort of lay a little sort of interesting, I think, groundwork for the conversation we're going to have.
Absolutely. Well, you talk about that in your book. You talk about how what you saw working for Waterkeeper actually, so you were a vegetarian at the time, which I think is so interesting. And then you're now a massive advocate for beef as a sustainable tool, as an ecological device for not only combating some of our concerns around climate change, but also just restoring landscapes and protecting the culture of the United States and the health of its people. So you entered into this world through your work at Waterkeeper. You talk about the wonderful farms you did visit, which contrasted the corporate entities you were pushing back against as they impacted these, rural communities negatively. So can you talk a little bit about that? That was prior to you meeting your husband and working as a cattle rancher. You started to get familiarity with the different types of farms and ranches in the United States. Can you tell me a little bit about that contrast and what you saw while you were working?
Yeah, well, it was really about people who had, were making a living on the land and were living again, multi-generational families in many cases, and they were often providing food or sometimes fiber or other agricultural products, but they were living and working in communities that they had spent their whole lives in, and in many cases their grandparents had grown up there, and they were committed to being in agriculture, but their well water was being contaminated, the air was becoming polluted from sort of huge plumes of hydrogen sulfide and other things that were coming off of these massive manure lagoons from some of these large concentrated hog operations, et cetera. And so what we were trying to do was basically just make it possible for people to defend their livelihood and their land. And so in that way, I see a lot of parallel between what I'm doing now. And I actually met my husband, Bill Niman, through this work because we were trying to also network with good agricultural operations that were really focused on high environmental stewardship and high quality food production, and also provided an opportunity for people to make a good living doing agriculture, which is such an important part of the whole story of how we're treating agriculture in this country today. Is it's always been a difficult profession to make economically viable, but is you and I both know in California in particular these days,
Yeah.
it is almost impossible for people in agriculture to continue making a decent living doing this line of work because at every turn there's more and more regulatory burden, there's more and more just difficulty getting what they're trying to do accomplished. And so I met my husband through this through the work. And actually, I was living as a lawyer in New York, and he had already started the ranch here in California. He's not a multi-generational rancher. He's actually from Minnesota. So we were both state Midwesterners, and he's from Minnesota. I'm from Michigan. And we, kind of shared that in common. I'm sure that was part of the bond we had instantly. But he had been living in California for a couple of decades already when I met him, and he had started the ranch here in Bolinas, where we live in Marin County. And he had also started a network of farmers and ranchers. So the Niman Ranch Network that he started was when he and we ended up getting married. So I'm sort of fast forwarding a little bit between when we met and we got married. It's about 2 years. And he, at that point in time, was the CEO of the Niman Ranch Company, and that was a network of over 700 farms and ranches. So he had built up this substantial enterprise of farmers and ranchers, and it was really the idea of the Niman Ranch Company was always to take the product from the farm gate essentially and be able to get it to the consumer so that the farmer and rancher could really focus on what they were doing on the land and then provide a way to get the processing accomplished and the distribution and the sales, et cetera. So that's what Niman Ranch was always about. And our ranch in Bolinas is kind of the first ranch that was part of the network. And we still live here today. So we're not part of the Niman Ranch Company anymore. But after Bill and I got married 23 years ago, I moved here and we have continued to ranch this land. And we're part of the Point Reyes National Seashore.
Right.
And so we've gotten very involved in the whole sort of the battle over the Point Reyes National Seashore in recent years.
Right. Right. I mean, in a way, your background set you up perfectly for this fight. And your husband and you've sued the Park Service over the 10 or the 11 ranching families that are leaving, 12 ranches, 11 families on Point Reyes. This is a story I've been covering, and I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast and read my work are very invested in those ranchers and in the outcome. I would say it's not totally resolved yet, but can you kind of talk a little bit about why you're not part of the ranchers who are leaving, why you and one other rancher, the only ranchers remaining on Point Reyes, and then why you sued the Park Service over this exit of your neighboring ranches?
Yeah, you just asked me a huge question, so I'll try
I
to
did.
answer it succinctly, which will be
Yes.
challenging, but I'll try not to talk for hours. So my attempt at a short answer would be, there were 14 families or 14 ranches, as you said, and ours is the southernmost ranch in the Point Reyes National Seashore. It's the only, I believe, the only non-multi-generational ranch because, as I mentioned, my husband started it. And then the David Evans and his wife Claire also are not departing. And the reason that these two ranches were not part of the deal, there were a couple of reasons. One is because there was litigation that was happening at the time. It was just the latest in a series of lawsuits that had been filed by environmental groups. And actually, I'm going to put that in quotes, environmental groups, because
Yeah.
having been quite involved in it for a long time, I've seen how there are a lot of motivations that are pushing this whole agenda, and a lot of them are not environmental. And I would put animal rights at the very top of that list. So they are purportedly environmental groups, but there are a lot of different agendas at play here. But in any case, there were a series of lawsuits that had been filed over the years. Ironically, in 2021, there was a big announcement of a record of decision, a revised plan for managing the park, or the seashore here, rather. And that was the result of prior litigation, which had been, in theory, seeking a sort of a very extensive public process and a participatory process in order to create this revised management plan for the seashore. And that happened, and it was a multi-year process, multi-million-dollar process, because there were tons of meetings, there were all kinds of different analyses that were done by different experts, et cetera. And so in 2021, there was a decision that was announced publicly. Okay, there's been all this review, all this input, and the plan is going to be updated in this way. And essentially, what that update said was that the ranching should continue, that there should be long-term leases, 20-year leases that should be extended to the ranching families, and that there should be some additional monitoring done, on water quality and certain other things that were proposed. But it was basically a vision for going forward that absolutely included agriculture. And the reason I said it was ironic is because that whole process, which was very extensive and very public, and was the result of litigation that was filed by the same litigants that then refiled after this was published, the demand was this public process, right? And then when the result was published in 2021 and those groups didn't like the outcome, they refiled another round of litigation for the Park Service and the ranchers to defend. Now, the Park Service, once again, as had been the case in the past, didn't really vigorously defend agriculture in the process and didn't really defend its revised record of decision that it came out with in 2021, this revised management plan. And instead, I don't quite know, I have not really been able to piece this all together, but somehow it ended up in a mediation process that involved all those litigants. And also the Nature Conservancy got brought in. And at some point in time, Congressman Jared Huffman said he had brought them in, and then recently he said he did not do that. So it's unclear what his role actually was. This is often the case where he says contradicting statements. But in any case, so then it went into a totally closed door process, and all of the ranching families that were part of that litigation were part of that closed door process, but they were required by the process to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And even Congressman Jared Huffman, who was part of these, discussions, signed this, or says he did. And again, I have doubts of whether a sitting member of Congress is actually even allowed to talk about federal or public lands as a member of Congress and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I don't even think that that's legal, but that's kind of that's a sub issue here. So in 2025, after about 3 years of that closed door process, no one was allowed to speak about it publicly, who was part of the process. This deal was announced in January 2025, where these 12 ranches would be shutting down and the people would be leaving. And it came as kind of a shock to everyone in the community because there was, of course, knowledge that there was a process going on. But because people weren't allowed to talk about it, there had been no public information that had come out prior to this. And we were not part of that process because we were not part of the litigation. And that was also true for David Evans and his wife, Claire. So initially, our thought was, well, that's incredibly unfortunate, but there's nothing we could do about this, we thought. And then after we had some conversations with some attorneys, we realized that actually in their haste to get this deal done quickly before the departure of the Biden administration, they had actually, and in fact, probably all along, there had been violations of the public process that is required by law. And so that's really the basis of our litigation, is that they didn't follow the process that we were told was required to create the 2021 update of the management plan, right?
Right.
And suddenly those exact same environmental groups that were suing for that public process were part of a behind closed doors, sealed process that came out, kind of suddenly in January of 2025. So we filed this lawsuit in order, our initial hope had been that maybe it would even allow some of those ranching families to stay. But we carefully worded our complaint and we consulted actually with their attorneys before doing this because we did not want to cause problems for any of those families. And so we wanted to make sure that there was no objection to us filing this lawsuit, and they did consent to us doing it. And our lawsuit says specifically that we're not attempting to disrupt the deal, but that we thought anyone who wanted to stay should be allowed to stay if they opted to do so. And for most of them, even though there was a tremendous amount of sadness and ambivalence and probably some uh, really strong feelings against doing this, um, by that point, they had gone through a long process and had begun making plans for the next thing they were going to be doing, and had even put, in some cases, investments into other properties that they would be moving. So none of those families are staying. All of them either have departed now or are in the process of departing. So what our lawsuit is really about at this point then is to try to keep that land in agriculture, because the Park Service also indicated at the time that they made this announcement in 2025, they indicated that all of that land that had previously been in agriculture would go into, sort of wild land or natural landscape, whatever. They have some term that they use. And so we're trying to prevent that from happening and keep this land in agriculture. And I should make clear that the park is around 70,000 acres, and this is really only about 20,000 acres that we're talking about. So it's actually a small
Right.
portion of the seashore.
Right, right. Well, thank you for condensing that. I know it's a huge story, and we could spend the whole hour that we have talking just about Point Reyes, especially given the public interest in it. But it sounds like your lawsuit is focused on keeping ranching, even if those original ranchers do leave. You want to keep ranching as part of Point Reyes, which was part of its initial establishment by the federal government, was always designed as a haven for agriculture. Um, and
Exactly.
those ranchers who were there at the time and their descendants who still ranch there today, as although they're leaving now, they were promised that their livelihood would be continued and protected as part of this park establishment. So this was breaking a longstanding promise to the community and to those ranchers. So it sounds like your lawsuit is about keeping ranching on Point Reyes and also just fighting for the transparent and legal process that the Park Service is supposed to follow. And we know that there
Correct.
was, or at least it seems that at least for some members of the Park Service, there was already a desired outcome. There was a journalist named Chris Bray who got some records requests completed that showed emails celebrating the ouster of these ranchers right before the Biden administration left, sort of under the gun, kind of getting this outcome finalized, and getting those ranchers off the point before the Trump administration came in and there was a turnover at the Park Service. So we know that there were some motivated people at the Park Service, which always just portrayed themselves as sort of a disinterested third party mediating this disagreement between, as you say, quote unquote, environmental groups and the ranchers. It's clear that the Park Service did have their thumb on the scale to some degree.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to say that I've discussed this with a number of people who have very extensive knowledge of local history around here. And what I've been told is that in 1962, when the seashore was initially set up, it was very clear, there was a really clear understanding among all of the parties involved that it was intended to preserve the agricultural, not just the livelihoods and the culture, but also the food production. There was a real and the scenic value. I mean, there was a lot of desire to keep agriculture here, keep the families here, keep the history here, and to continue to be able to buy local food. And these were really high quality food items. It's not just food products. It's actually grass-based organic dairy for the most part.
Right.
There's one dairy that was not fully grass-based, but for the most part, that's what was out here, and grass-fed beef and, some certified organic um, grass-fed beef. But in any case, all small scale, um, all very sort of nutrient rich food and of the exact kind of food that we need more of in this country and need to have more available for people. And so it just, to me, the irony of the whole thing, that at the very time that we're recognizing the need for more high quality food, we have members of the federal government and even our own congressman really working to eliminate. And it's not just moving, these operations basically shut down, and so you're actually eliminating a really important food source for this region. It's just troubling on so many levels. But yes,
Completely.
the park service was not a neutral entity, and neither was our congressman at all.
Right. Yes, it's so ironic. Covering this story was heartbreaking because these are the exact types of ranches and dairies that we are talking about in America right now that we want more of. And I think your book was early in
Exactly.
describing this type of operation and how we need to see a resurgence of this type of small, independent, sustainable ranch and dairy and farm operation. And I just imagine on a personal level, this must have be really hard ongoing. It's just happened last year. I'm sure these ranches are just now kind of leaving. What's that been like for you and your family watching almost all of your neighbors forced out in this secretive process? Um, it must totally change your community and what you've surrounded yourself with for the past 20 years.
Well, there has been a lot of sadness from, just, I mean, the roots are so deep for those
Mhm.
families. And I learned from talking to a local school principal. I sit on the school board here for our school, and the Point Reyes community, which is just north of us. Um, we're also connected with that school, and I found out that they lost over 30 children because this was 200 people that lived on these ranches, and all of them were displaced. Some of them were part of these ranching families, and others of them were people who worked on the ranches, and others of them were just people who lived on the ranches but did other jobs in the community. So it was a lot of people for these small towns, and it's just had a really dramatic ripple effect. And um, the sort of silver lining, I would say, is that there has been a really strong recognition of the value of these
Mm.
farms and ranches and of these families. As part of our litigation, we have hosted some community wide meetings, and the Department of Interior recently hosted. I'm sure you're aware of this, Keely. A large, over 600 people came to this meeting, which is a huge meeting for a small town like this. People came from all over to talk about, sort of the future of this area and agriculture specifically in this area and what people wanted to see there. And it was, sort of an information exchange of, the federal government and the Nature Conservancy and some other parties sort of sharing information, but also taking input from the community. And I was there for the whole time at that meeting, and there was, I would say, probably at least probably 4 to 1. The people in attendance were people that were strongly supportive of and concerned about the loss of the families and the loss of the agriculture, and wanted to find out, well, what can we do? What can we do differently going forward? And I think there's actually some pretty significant energy. So, even though it's a sad story, there could be an interesting next chapter that might not be, just that this might not be the final chapter. And that's what our litigation is all about. We're trying to keep the door open and keep the process moving forward of discussing, okay, how do we move forward in a way that preserves the food production and the agriculture here?
Right. And the Park Service is a huge part of this. And I think that it's an ongoing story how much the Park Service was involved and to what degree the ideology at the Park Service needs to be addressed, because this is not an isolated case. I mean, just this week I was writing about the fire on Santa Rosa Island, which brings up the history of the Channel Islands and the ranching families forced out of those islands. And even at the time, the superintendent, shortly after leaving, came to Point Reyes. I don't know if you were at this meeting, but his name is Tim Setnica, and he warned the ranchers of Point Reyes that the Park Service was coming for them next, and that, the Park Service had it out for ranching. And it was, at the time, probably sounded very conspiratorial, but that's exactly what happened. So there's some rot at the Park Service, but our representative, Congressman Jared Huffman, seems to have been completely complicit with forcing these ranchers out. Was that your catalyst for deciding to run for Congress?
Yes, I mean, it was kind of the entryway, I would say, because I had voted for Jared Huffman. I had met him before he first was elected, and my husband and I both had. And um, I have to say, candidly, I was never like super blown away by him. But I thought, okay, he's okay. And so we voted for him. He was the guy on the ballot, and so we supported him. And we voted for him again, and we voted for him again, and, we kinda put it on autopilot and didn't pay super close attention. But starting a couple of years ago, around the time that all of this stuff was happening with the Point Reyes situation with the ranchers, I started to hear more and more incidents and, issues that I thought were really troubling about his conduct. And it goes even back further because when he was first elected, that's right when the effort to remove the oyster farm was happening. And he sort of took a publicly neutral stance, which I think is a weird, kind of non a way to avoid controversy, which in and of itself I find sort of cowardly. But he actually wasn't neutral because I talked to many people that were involved in that situation, and he was in favor of removing the oyster farm and acted accordingly. And so there were things that he was doing kind of behind the scenes that helped cause that to happen, and that got shut down. And at that time, the Lunny family and others were saying, this is just the first thing that's going to happen, and then they're going to come for the ranches. But Secretary Salazar made a public statement saying, no, that's not the case. We're even going to offer 20-year extended leases because we recognize that we want to have the ranchers stay and the ranching stay. And that just turned out to be words because that never happened. I believe a typical lease that got signed around that time was about 5 years, but then it just got short. The time period got shorter and shorter. And so people were on 1-year leases or even month by month leases after that. And so no long-term leases were ever offered. And it turned out that it was absolutely true that the oyster farm thing was kind of a precursor of things to come. And Jared Huffman had this perspective, our congressperson here, he's from NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council was his background before he got into elected politics. And so he worked as an environmental lawyer. Now, I did the same thing. Okay. So I don't automatically think that's a bad thing. Okay. But I understand how those organizations work. And more, the perspective is that humans are despoiling the natural environment. And whether it's fishermen or people in the timber industry or whether it's people in agriculture, these environmental groups increasingly are kind of at odds with those people that are practicing their professions on the land. And so, what I believe is that Jared Huffman's sort of worldview was really shaped by his years at NRDC because everything that he's been doing in this district, this congressional district, is really from that perspective that we don't want to have. If we have something that's a natural area, again in quotes, that it's inherently in conflict to have humans doing any kind of activity that's like a commercial activity, anything that produces food, anything that produces, timber or fish or whatever, or oysters. That's a problem from that perspective. And the irony is people still have to eat. So it's not like you're going to actually shut that stuff down. It's that you're going to shut it down here. And you're gonna buy it from someplace else, and you're gonna ship it in. So it's like a really weird. I mean, I don't even really get it from the big picture standpoint how this is a pro-environmental stance, but they take this very absolutist perspective. We don't want the oyster farm. We don't want the ranchers here, and we're gonna quote unquote protect this land. And interestingly, there's a local right in my own community, right outside my door here, actually, there's a petition by another sort of smaller environmental group called the EAC, Environmental Action Coalition of Marin. And they've been trying to eliminate the remaining access to the fishery for the local fishermen. And this is a multi-generational, small scale, very carefully practiced fishery here. And all of the fisher people that are here in our community were involved in all of the different years in which restrictions were added to the local fishery. And they're generally very supportive of those restrictions because they want to protect the resource too. And they're, having known many of these people for many years, these are very um, careful stewards of the fishery here and really cherish it. But Jared Huffman, our congressman, signed on to that petition to eliminate their access to the fishery. And so it's just this pattern. And then after it became very controversial, he took a neutral stance. Didn't get involved in the issue in any way to try to help, but just decided to pull back and not support the petition to eliminate the fisheries. But to me, this is kind of a worldview that he has and that I think is incredibly inappropriate for, in particular, this congressional district. Because District 2, especially since Proposition 50, which added um, Shasta County, Modoc County, and Siskiyou County to the district. And that is a lot of land where people are living off the land. And it used to be even more so the case, but because of the fact that the timber industry has gotten so curtailed in recent years, it's not as much true anymore, but it's still. This is people who are living out in the land and on the land and from the land and producing goods for all of society from these areas. And I felt the reason I decided to run for Congress was because I felt that Jared Huffman was doing a very poor job representing the people in our district. And I had already begun talking for quite some time about who we could find to run against him. And then when Proposition 50 was being discussed, and I realized that it would change this district to add 3 more counties that were very rural, I just felt there was kind of this almost like call to action, like someone who is actually connected with rural communities and agriculture in particular has to run because he cannot represent these people. He will not do it correctly. He won't even really try. He's going to say a few words in the election cycle to try to get their votes, but he doesn't have the capacity. He doesn't really believe that they matter or that they should be even allowed to practice their livelihoods. So that's when I started considering the idea for myself because I have a background. We haven't really talked about this, but in addition to the 5 years I've spent on the school board, I was on the city council for Kalamazoo, Michigan for 2 terms for 4 years. And I've just been involved. Even in high school, I was volunteering on campaigns. In college, I spent 2 semesters in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill working in congressional offices. I mean, it's just something I've always been really interested in being connected with and, having involvement in just public issues and trying to come up with ways to do things better. That's sort of something I've always been passionate about. So when I realized if Proposition 50 passed, that it would change District 2 to look this way, that's when I thought I should run for this seat.
Yeah. I completely hear you when you say he is an inappropriate representative for this district in particular, because Sonoma and Marin uniquely are an example of progressive, sort of, forward-thinking agriculture. And you've been kind of a city on a hill for the sustainable agriculture movement for generations. I spoke with Albert Strauss, one of my first podcast episodes, and he was sharing with me how the prince at the time, now King Charles, visited on his honeymoon. His interest in environmental minded farming sort of peaked by Marin, and he brought his wife with him for their honeymoon to visit the area because it's truly a beacon of what agriculture can look like. Small farms and ranches that answer to their community and have a generational mindset protecting the environment. So you have such an interesting background for this district. I'm curious as you been on the campaign trail. Do you think Marin is ready to consider an independent? You've decided to run independent. Jared Huffman has been the representative for quite a while. I want to say 8 terms, but I'm not sure if I have that right.
He will have finished 7 terms at the end of
Okay,
this
so he's
term,
running
yeah.
for his 8th. Okay. So what do you think as you're out on the campaign trail? Do you think that Marin is ready? Do you think that they're the largest voting bloc that you'd be representing?
Yes, although Reading is a very large city too. It's the biggest city in the district,
True.
actually. So
True.
there are a lot of votes outside of Marin, but this is the most important chunk of the district in terms of the number of votes. Um, and I guess I think that's what kind of gives me almost an ideal set of backgrounds, parts of my background, because I've lived here for 23 years in Marin County. I really know this community and the issues and the perspectives here, and I've been directly involved. We have a ranch, we have a business here. I've been very involved in our community here. I've been on a lay leader at my church for almost 20 years here in Bolinas. I've been on our school board for 5 years. I've coached Little League for 3 seasons. I know lots of people in the community and just actually, really love this community. This is a very closely knit area where people know each other and people support one another in ways that are quite extraordinary. And so it's a beautiful place, and it's a place I really care about and love living in. But at the same time, and actually it's interesting to note, I live in a small town. I mean, Bolinas is actually, we have about 1,200 residents or something, and our school, which is from pre-K to 8th grade, is about 130 students. So it's a small town. So I'm living in a small town every day and practicing agriculture and living and working on a ranch. So I share that with people throughout the district, but then I'm also part of this more urbanized, we're very close to San Francisco. We can literally see it from our ranch. And so I think I have a kind of an unusual set of parts to my background that help me be able to understand every part of the district. And I think that's what's going to take. I think this is going to be a really challenging district to do a good job representing. I think, even given my unusual, sets of experiences and life history, it will be very challenging for me to adequately represent everyone because of the fact that it's, very liberal and very conservative, very rural, much more urbanized. There are no huge cities, but there are, significant urban centers in the district. And so to me, I think the real, a couple of things I want to say about that is, one, I think the work is actually at the community level. I really believe that whoever is in this seat should be focused on what's happening in the different parts of the district and really trying to learn about all of the challenges, and then what could a member of Congress do to actually help that community and that set of issues. Is there a problem with a lack of a processing facility, for example, for the people in agriculture? Is this a question of, a lack of rural healthcare? That's something I heard a lot about in my travels, especially up in Siskiyou and Shasta and Modoc. I've spent a lot of time talking to people on the phone in those areas as well as physically being there as well, and that was something I heard a lot about. And so, to me, the person who represents this district has to try to really learn the entire district and understand what the specific challenges are and where could a member of Congress help improve the situation and also strengthen, the good stuff that's already happening, and just provide that kind of support. And also be a bridge actually between the different parts of, I mean, I've already been doing this. This has been kind of one of the most rewarding parts. I've been down here in Marin talking about wolves a whole bunch. And when I bring this up, people are like, What's the word you're saying? I mean, literally, they don't know what word I'm saying. I'm like, because people ask me all the time, oh, what are people talking about up there? And they are curious. And I'll just say wolves, and they're like, what's the word? What are you saying? And I have to spell it.
Wow.
And so I'm like, wow, we are really on, like very different planes. And then I had a very interesting conversation with a woman from Shasta County where we were talking about firearms. And I was saying how this was something where there was such a very different perspective depending on where you were and who you were talking to. And I was saying when you talk about guns in Marin County, people tend to think about crime and school shootings. And it was really interesting. I was talking to her on the phone and she said, "Wow, school shootings. Yeah, those are terrible." And it was really interesting. I could just see her kind of processing what I was saying. And, she had been urging me that I should take a really strong stance on the Second Amendment. And I said, well, I do support, the Second Amendment, but let me put a little bit of nuance in terms of the stuff that I'm hearing from, other people and what their concerns are. And so, um, I feel like I'm already beginning that work of just trying to help people sit in each other's shoes a little bit. And we have such a diverse district here that I think it's a unique opportunity. I think we need to do this as a nation. And I've heard a lot of criticism of the Democrats in particular for being incredibly out of touch with rural communities and rural concerns, and I would agree with that. Um, but I think there's just kind of work to be done, um, you know, in terms of just better connection and understanding among people. You know, what's making their lives harder, and and where's the common ground, the things that we all care about, and there's a lot of that. So
Yeah.
sharing that, in different both directions, or in all directions, I should say. It's not like a one, it's not like just like two directions.
Yeah. I've thought often especially since working in what I'm doing now, that our divide as a country is largely rural and urban. And once those conversations start to happen, we soften, and our differences aren't
Yeah.
always as stark as we think when we can kind of talk to folks who are just experiencing a different reality. And I think your district might be the starkest example of that rural urban divide in one district. I
Yes, we're
mean,
like
maybe in the
we're like
country.
ground zero here. Yeah, exactly. We're
Exactly,
ground zero here
exactly.
for the rural urban divide. But the
That's
thing
right.
is, to me, that's kind of exciting because it's like, um, I feel like this is the work that needs to be
Mhm.
done in this country right now. And honestly, you know, I was not considering running for Congress at all. I mean, I had actually been urged several times when I was in my 20s and early 30s when I was on the city council for Kalamazoo, Michigan, because I was never a member of a political party. So I actually got formally approached by both the Democratic and the Republican leadership in southwestern Michigan to run for higher office. And at that time, I thought it was not something that I should do at that time. And then I kind of put it aside and never thought I would ever do that again. And I hadn't, even been involved in elected politics for a while until I got on the school board. But when I started thinking about doing this, I thought, this is the work that is before us as a country. And I have something to offer here. And as you said, District 2 of California is like the perfect kind of microcosm of
Yeah.
this national urban rural separation. And and so what if we could just right here in this district start actually having some really interesting conversations, and if the member of Congress was actually committed to trying to help bridge those divides rather than just adding fuel to the fire of the divide, which is what I have seen Jared Huffman do again and again.
Well, he has. I mean, I know this personally. I'm obviously from Potter Valley. I've been covering the Potter Valley Project dispute. He's referenced me often as a MAGA influencer right wing, which I think is a dog whistle to try to get people to not even think about water supply, because I've never portrayed myself that way or portrayed this argument as a political one. I certainly don't think it's a political argument. It's a very pragmatic argument, and a problem that needs to be solved. Have you talked to people about the Potter Valley Project and the water supply issue?
Yes, I have, and I've learned a lot from you, Keely, because I've watched some of your interviews and I've read a number of articles about it. and it's so complicated just trying to understand, all of the components and even the geography of it all. I have been up in that area. I have not been to the dams, but I have looked at videos and pictures of them. But I have been up through in Mendocino and Humboldt and Sonoma and kind of all of the areas where the water bodies that come into this that feed into these dams. Where they originate and where they go down, and so I've tried to learn some things about it. What troubles me about it is that, again, to me, this seems like another example of where, and the same could probably be said about the Klamath Dam removals. That you have.
Okay, we had a little interruption there. Our feed got cut. So, Nicolette, you were just saying we're talking about the Potter Valley dams. You were likening it to the Klamath Dam removal. Some similarities there.
Yeah, well, it just seems to me from what I have learned about. I mean, these are such complicated processes and questions, and so many people are affected, and so much is, changed by these dam removal projects. And I've been trying to learn about them, as especially over the last few months. And what I have learned is that when you take dams out, people will talk about it in very simplistic terms, and they'll talk about it as, for example, restoration of habitat for a specific species like salmon or something like that. But in fact, these are really dramatic changes, and they can affect thousands of peoples, and they can affect their ability even to continue to live on their land. And that's what we've already seen with the Klamath Dam removals. So what I would like to do in this Potter Valley situation, I'm still really learning it and getting myself acquainted with it, but is to really, I mean, I'm viewing it with a very skeptical eye, is what I would say. And I think whenever you have an existing source of water, you have water storage, you have something that was built and created, and people have become, they've built their livelihoods upon it, they've built their farms, they've built their homes. The assumption should be that there's a very heavy burden of proof, I would say, before something like that should happen. So, I would like to see something else happen. I would like to see the Potter Valley dams retained. And I'm excited by the fact that Secretary Brooke Rollins is interested in trying to make this happen. So um, I'm hoping that that works
Yeah.
out.
Well, I appreciate your, pragmatic response to all of these issues, and I think that's very evident throughout our conversation. And I hope that people see how you guide. Oh, there goes my little guy. One second. He's in a very chatty stage, so just one interruption after another for us today. But I think people,
I hopefully our listeners will be patient. I think they will be.
my little, you know, angel on my shoulder right now.
Yeah,
But
I mean, babies and kitties and dogs and flowers. We all need more of all that, so it's good.
and that's why we're doing this, right? For this next generation coming up. That's
Right.
what makes all of these issues so important. So anyway, I think the way that you approach these issues, voters can see what guides you and how you come to all of these complex topics. And I noticed, speaking of your pragmatic approach, there was an article that came out either today or yesterday on Jared Huffman. It cites you as the chief contender for his long held office. And I noticed his language was very different. He was asked about the wolves up in Northern California, and he sounded much more pragmatic than the Jared Huffman I'm used to hearing from. So that tells me that you've had an impact on this campaign and this race already.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that, it's going to kind of ring hollow because he had 13 and a half years to show some kind of flexibility or interest in, trying to come up with approaches that really work for people that live in these areas that are affected by, whether it's wolves or water or timber, whatever the issue is. And he's actually had a very um, absolutist perspective. In fact, just earlier today, I was watching a video. I had heard about it before, but I hadn't actually seen it when Congressman Doug LaMalfa, not too long before he passed away, unfortunately, um, was talking about Jared Huffman specifically and his attitude toward the wolf issue and how Huffman had, actually mocked the idea that this was a serious concern. And it got Congressman LaMalva so angry. And he was saying, when are you going to take my people seriously? And when are you going to take these issues seriously? And I just thought it was actually kind of a perfect illustration of the 13 and a half years that we've seen the true colors of Jared Huffman. So I'm glad he's saying some of the right words right now. But I don't really think we can take any of it at face value. It's only words.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you. He's had a long time to represent rural voters, and he has not done so to date. You can look at his past years of representation and see the ideology that I truly think guides what he does more so than representing the diverse folks that he stands for in our nation's capital. So I know we have a very short window today, and I really appreciate you making time for me on the last week of your campaign before the primary, which I have full faith that you're going to advance on to the November race. And I'm excited to hear you continue to speak eloquently about these issues that are so existential for us in Northern California. But there's so many different things I could talk to you about. Is there anything you want to say, anything you want to add here before we go?
Well, I guess I would just say I have felt even before I started this campaign that we were really at a time in our country where we really needed people who could work across party lines and who could really kind of come from a true place of, center and be able to understand and listen to really diverse perspectives. And what has happened with this particular congressional district is you had a very, very gerrymandered Democratic district, and it was one that contained a lot of rural areas and some conservative voters, but was really dominated by a more urbanized, more liberal population. And now what's happened is it's been redrawn. And so you actually have some of the most liberal voters and some of the most conservative voters possibly in the country drawn into the same district. And so and you have a much more urban type perspective and a much more rural type perspective put together in this district. There doesn't seem to be a lot of working to bridge that gap. And I've actually seen quite a few articles suggesting that the Democratic Party is not going to ever be able to win back the White House until they address that particular problem within their ranks. And so I would just say, I hope people will keep an eye on what's happening in our district and elsewhere in the country in these races where there are people that are really running and with the sort of needing to represent the rural voices. And I am very committed to that. That's actually what's motivated me to step into this race is wanting to make sure that all of the voices are heard and feeling that this was really particularly needed right now because of the fact that three primarily rural counties have been added to this district. So I hope we can begin here in that rebuilding process, rebuilding the bridge between all Americans and all Californians in this place.
I love that vision. I love a good story. And I think the story of an environmental attorney turned cattle rancher on Point Reyes running against Jared Huffman is a phenomenal story. And I love
It's got some interesting
it
twists
really
to it,
does.
yeah.
It really does. And it would be so exciting across the board for all the folks who listen to this podcast across the country to have somebody who really understands the case for beef and the argument for it as part of our future in Congress as deeply as you do. So I cannot recommend this book enough, Defending Beef by Nicolette Niman. Truly an amazing book. All of you guys that listen to me will like it and you will learn something as I am right now going through it. Thank you so much for your time, Nicolette. I really appreciate you making time for us in your busy week and excited to see where your campaign goes. Would love to talk to you again as we near November.
Thank you. I look forward to that.